Okay, so next up is, hold on, contemporary virtue ethics. Right. So after Aristotle, and from the time of Aristotle up until um, roughly 100, 150 AD, virtue ethics was one of the most preeminent moral theories on the market, for lack of a better term. But at that point, right, 150 AD or so, Christianity, with its absolutist morality, right, do what God says, this is right, this is wrong, there's no real gray area, that sort of took over. And it maintained a stronghold on moral thinking in Europe and the European tradition of philosophy until, um, well, until about the 1700s is when it really began to first crack. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that it crumbled entirely, right? And led, which paved the way for the reemergence of virtue ethics as a moral theory. Right. So contemporary virtue ethics has this sort of history behind it, um, where we essentially have a nearly 2,000-year hiatus, where it undergoes no real development other than the subsumption into Christian theology and Christian philosophy and religious philosophy, right? We get a lot of the heavenly graces, i.e., virtues, and the deadly sins from modifications of works by modifications of Aristotle and Plato's works by Christian philosophers. Um, but there's an additional sort of twist to the contemporary virtue ethic mentality that has to be accounted for, that uh, involves the abandoning, as it were, of the teleological worldview, which is bound up with what allowed for Christianity, or not Christianity, for virtue ethics to reemerge in the first place. See, towards the end of the 1800s and on through to uh, around the 1950s, right, we saw a whole bunch of developments socially, including, two world wars, the breakdown of the advancement of science, and a whole bunch of things that cracked this teleological worldview that's also at the center of like Christian, uh, biblical doctrine in general, Christian within the uh, Judaic tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Islamic tradition. Right? There's this idea of a teleology, right, in the form of religion, which says that there's an eschatology, right, a direction that God is taking the universe in. Right, He has a plan and it's good. So within this eschatological scheme, there still remains this idea of a teleological purpose for every living thing since God created them. Uh, with the advancements in science and whatnot, and its pervasion into the general culture, we saw a cracking of this mindset, just a gradually softening of it until we get to about the 1950s, right? Post World War II. So, with the loss of the teleological element, to reaffirm virtue ethics as a contemporary theory, we must now refigure the relationship between virtue, reason, and eudaimonia in the sense of flourishing, right? Not in the sense of happiness, but in the sense of flourishing. What does it mean to have a flourishing character, right? A virtuous character. And as a product of this, we get two competing accounts of virtue. We have what are called the dispositional account, which is presented by Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe, properly Irish name, which fits because she was born in Limerick, Ireland, where you're and all who are born in Limerick, Ireland, are cursed to speak in only limericks. Right? Anyway, we have the dispositional account, which says that virtue is merely habit. Who you are defines what you do. And then we have the right conduct account, which is put forward by John McDowell, which says that virtue is doing what is right. Something, again, that a term that had loosened over like the last 100 years. Like the notion of moral rightness, it takes on a different context in virtue ethics than it does in a more principle-based moral theory, as we'll discuss down the line. Right. So, the dispositional account says that all that matters to virtue, regardless of, regarding its relationship to character and reason, is that it is character, right? That it is who I am, right? It's habit. That's all. It's enough to have a virtuous habit in order to be virtuous. And Anscombe, G-E-M Anscombe, to shorten her frankly absurd list of names and their length, she made this case for the reemergence of virtue ethics as a moral theory in her paper Modern Moral Philosophy, which was written 1948, 49, right? And in this paper, she makes pretty much the case that I've already put forward, just with a few additional points, right? She says that we should drop the moral vocab of right action. Right? This is something that clearly the right conduct account takes issue with. But we should drop the idea of right action, as though morality is black and white, it's dichotomous, it's yes or no. And she takes the time to respond to many and highlight many existing problems within the principle-based moral theories of deontology and consequentialism more generally, and show how they, because of their focus on this vocabulary of right action, they aren't self-sufficient or are otherwise self-defeating, right? They undermine themselves in some form or fashion. And as a consequence, we should get rid of right or wrong in the strong sense for describing things, and instead go back to describing things for what they are, right? Specific, when I say things, I mean like moral actions. We should describe moral actions for what they are. Actions by individuals that have an intention behind them, because that's what matters the most, right? You can judge the action on its own merit, but which is what the principle-based accountants do, right? But if you're judging the action without looking at the intention behind the action, then you miss some of the important nuance to the moral judgment. Especially since what we're doing, Anscombe argues, when we make moral judgments, is we're judging a person's character, right? In connection with an action. It's not just a judgment of the action itself, it's a judgment of the action situationally and the action as a reflection of the individual's moral character. So we look at the people and judge them rather than the action in isolation or as the consequences are concerned. But this does raise an issue, and one that Anscombe never sufficiently addresses, of how do we know what virtues or character traits are best or most valuable? Uh, Anscombe's own answer to this is that we see those character traits we most desire and we emulate them. And that's all that there is to it. We find exemplars of character traits. We find someone who we think best exemplifies honesty, and we imitate them until we become like them, right? It's a sort of ape it until you make it sort of a mentality, right? However, this doesn't address the underlying problem of incompleteness, right, with her theory. Uh, the incompleteness really comes in two forms. First, from the fact that even if we accept this model of ape it till we make it, right, for imitation, there's no way of discerning how, there's no way that she presents of discerning how to identify who is a good exemplar in the first place. So we will wind up having competing notions of who exemplifies various virtues in the best way. Right? One example for this might be exemplifying uh, Trump for his assertiveness, right? But there's a distinction between being assertive and aggressive, and Trump is very much aggressive, right? Assertive is like making claims with confidence, with assurity, right? Aggressive is being out and out like almost pretty much attacking, right? It's being hostile to any sort of opposition, whereas assertion just continues to make the claims with confidence until proven otherwise, right? One's more open to adjusting their worldview than the other. The aggressive person tends to be one who is far more defensive because and not willing as much to see evidence to the contrary of their existing beliefs. So, that's a case where it's like you can misattribute a virtue to someone and thereby pick a wrong exemplar. The second issue of incompleteness arises from, in particular, what do we do in case of conflicting virtues, right? How do we navigate situations where the virtues come into conflict with each other, right? Where honesty and kindness kind of come at loggerheads, right? Where you want to be kind to someone, but honesty sort of demands that because they haven't responded, because they're facing an unpleasant truth, right? That needs to be delivered bluntly. How do you find the balance between the two? That's one particular issue. Okay. And this all stands in contrast with the right conduct account. Now, really quickly, we can sort of forgive Anscombe for the incompleteness of her theorem and for the many issues that exist in the dispositional account. There are a number of theorists who have done their best to rectify those issues, although I think that they continue to persist in one form or another. That's a personal opinion. One particular virtue ethicist who's done a lot of work with the dispositional account would be Alistair McIntyre, who wrote the book After Virtue, which is probably the best defense of the dispositional account out there. I personally think it falls a bit flat, but I also have a bias towards the right conduct account, and I'll freely admit that. But McIntyre's own version of the dispositional account is far too nuanced to present in an intro course. Otherwise, I would, right? So, moving on, Next, we'll address John McDowell's right conduct account of virtue.